The clinking of crystal glasses and the soft hum of a string quartet echoed through the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton. 300 of the city's most elite figures, investors, politicians, and business moguls, were dressed to the nines, celebrating the 30th anniversary of my father's manufacturing empire. Standing at the podium, bathed in a warm spotlight, was Arthur, my father, a man who built his reputation on the illusion of being a family man. He leaned into the microphone, flashing that charismatic million-dollar smile that had fooled everyone in this room. I couldn't have built this legacy without my rock, my beautiful wife Brenda, and my son Julian, who is poised to take the reins. The crowd erupted into polite applause. Then, Arthur's eyes scanned the room and locked onto me, sitting at a dimly lit table near the back. His smile morphed into a cruel, patronizing smirk. And, of course, my daughter Chloe, who finally decided to show up to something important. Let's hope she actually finishes her dinner, since she has a habit of quitting things halfway. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter washed over the ballroom. Brenda, draped in a ridiculous amount of diamonds, covered her mouth to hide a vicious grin. Julian just shook his head, looking at me like I was a piece of trash that had blown in from the street. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to lower my head, burst into tears, and run out of the room just like I used to when I was a helpless teenager. Instead, I stood up. I didn't rush. I smoothly picked up my $200 glass of vintage champagne, locked eyes with the man who had made my life a living hell, and raised it in a mock toast. My voice was calm, but it cut through the sudden silence of the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. Enjoy the champagne, Arthur, because this is the absolute last time you will ever see me, and it's the last time you will ever have the privilege of disrespecting me. I set the glass down with a sharp clink, turned on my $900 Louboutin heels, and walked out of the ballroom, leaving 300 powerful people dead silent, and my father's jaw practically on the floor. My name is Chloe. I am 31 years old, and what my father didn't know at that exact moment was that I wasn't just his estranged failure of a daughter. I was the silent owner of Apex Solutions, the vendor currently keeping his entire company from going completely bankrupt, and I was about 30 seconds away from pulling the plug on his entire empire. But to understand how I ended up meticulously destroying my father's life in front of the city's elite, we need to go back. Back to when I was just a ghost in my own home. Brief pause for pacing, music transition. My childhood basically ended when I was 8 years old. That was the year my mother passed away from a very sudden, aggressive illness. She was the warmth in our house, the glue that held everything together. When she died, it felt like all the color was sucked out of my world. For about a year, it was just me and my dad. He was emotionally distant, throwing himself into his business, but at least we had peace. Then Brenda happened. My father met Brenda at some corporate charity gala. She was a decade younger than him, painfully ambitious, and came as a package deal with her 10-year-old son, Julian. Within 6 months, they were married, and she had moved her entire life into our home. Almost overnight, the dynamic shifted. Have you ever heard of the term golden child? Well, Julian was the platinum diamond-encrusted child. He could do no wrong. Brenda treated him like he was the second coming of Christ, and my father, desperate to keep his shiny new trophy wife happy, quickly adopted the same attitude. Me? I became the scapegoat, the interloper. Living with Brenda was like walking on eggshells completely blindfolded. She was a master manipulator, fluent in the toxic language of gaslighting. If I left a glass on the counter, it wasn't just a mistake. It was Chloe being deliberately disrespectful to all the hard work I put into this house. I remember one specific incident when I was 12. I had this delicate, vintage music box that belonged to my late mother. It was my most prized possession. One afternoon, I came home from school to find it smashed on the hardwood floor of my bedroom. Julian was standing right there, holding a baseball, looking completely unbothered. I was hysterical. I ran downstairs crying to my dad and Brenda. Do you know what Brenda said? Without missing a beat, she looked at my dad, sighed dramatically, and said, "Arthur, I told Chloe not to leave her delicate things near the edge of the shelf. Julian was just walking by, and it fell. Now she's trying to blame my poor boy because she's jealous of him." I looked at my father, waiting for him to defend me, waiting for him to see the truth. Instead, he rubbed his temples, looked at me with sheer annoyance, and said, "Chloe, stop causing drama. Clean up the mess and apologize to your brother for yelling at him." That was the exact moment something inside me broke. But it was also the moment something inside me solidified. I realized that my father didn't love me. He loved the picture-perfect image Brenda provided for his corporate brand. I was just an inconvenient reminder of his past life. From that day on, I stopped trying to win their affection. I discovered the gray rock method long before I knew there was a psychological term for it. I made myself invisible. I gave short, uninteresting answers. I hid in my room, I buried myself in textbooks, and completely detached myself emotionally from the three toxic strangers living in my house. While Julian was given a brand new BMW for his 16th birthday, I was taking the public bus and working weekend shifts at a local diner just to afford my own winter coat. While Julian was partying and scraping by with C- grades, I was pulling all-nighters, maintaining a 4.0 GPA. I had one goal, and one goal only: get a full scholarship, get out of that house, and never ever look back. And for a while, the plan was working perfectly. By the time I was 20, I was a junior at a top state university, crushing my supply chain management major, and fully financially independent from my father. I thought I had finally escaped the toxicity. But I underestimated how far a narcissist will go when their golden child needs a bailout. And I had no idea that the ultimate betrayal was just around the corner. By the time I was 20, I thought I had successfully rewritten my own destiny. I was in my junior year at a reputable state university, majoring in supply chain management. I had a 4.0 GPA, I was the president of the logistics club, and I was working two part-time jobs just to make sure I never had to ask my father for a single cent. I was exhausted, living off caffeine and sheer willpower, but for the first time in my life, I was genuinely happy. I had boundaries, I had peace. Then, 2 weeks before my final exams, my phone rang. It was Arthur. He hadn't called me in 6 months, not even for my birthday. When I answered, his voice was clipped and authoritative, like he was talking to a low-level employee. "Chloe, come home this weekend. We're having a family meeting. It's mandatory." He hung up before I could even say hello. A pit formed in my stomach. I knew that tone. But foolishly, a tiny, pathetic part of me wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wanted to congratulate me on making the dean's list again. I took a 3-hour bus ride back to my hometown. When I walked through the heavy oak doors of my father's McMansion, the air felt suffocating. The house smelled of Brenda's nauseatingly expensive vanilla perfume and sheer, unadulterated entitlement. I was ushered into my father's home office. Arthur was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk. Brenda was perched on the arm of his leather chair, dripping in designer jewelry, while Julian lounged on the sofa, scrolling through his brand new iPhone with a smug, punchable smirk on his face. "Take a seat, Chloe," Arthur said, not looking up from his laptop. I stayed standing. "I have midterms next week, Dad." "What's going on?" Arthur finally looked at me, intertwining his fingers. "Julian got accepted into the MBA program at Stanford Graduate School of Business." "Oh," I said, genuinely surprised. Julian had barely scraped through his undergrad with a C average, mostly by paying people to write his essays. "Congratulations!" Julian didn't even look up from his phone. "Yeah, well, top tier requires top talent." Arthur cleared his throat. "Palo Alto is incredibly expensive. Between the Stanford tuition, housing, and keeping up the lifestyle required to network with the right people, the costs are astronomical. And right now, the company's cash flow is tied up in expansions." I narrowed my eyes. My father's manufacturing company was pulling in 8 figures a year. "Okay, and how does this involve me?" Brenda chimed in, using that sickly, sweet, condescending tone that always made my skin crawl. "Well, sweetie, family is about sacrifice. We all have to pitch in to support Julian's future. It's an investment for all of us." "Pitch in?" I scoffed. "I pay for my own tuition with scholarships. I pay my own rent. I haven't asked you for a dime since I turned 18. Arthur's face hardened. "That's exactly the point. You've proven you can handle yourself. Julian needs this degree to take over the family business. You don't. You're studying, what is it, packing boxes." "Supply chain management," I corrected, my voice trembling with rising anger. "Whatever." Arthur waved his hand dismissively. "The point is, I need you to drop out." The room went dead silent. I stared at him, sure I had misheard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Arthur said coldly. "You're going to withdraw from your university. I've already arranged a job for you as a receptionist at my company. You'll move back into your old room here, rent-free, of course, but your entire salary will be funneled directly into Julian's living expense fund for Stanford. Once he graduates in 2 years, you can go back and finish your little degree." My jaw literally dropped. The sheer audacity of it was paralyzing. You want me to throw away my scholarships, drop out of a top-tier program in my junior year, and work a minimum wage job to fund Julian's luxury lifestyle in California? It's not luxury, Chloe. It's a necessity for networking, Brenda snapped, dropping the sweet act. Stop being so incredibly selfish. Your brother is going to be a CEO. You're just being difficult, as usual. No, I said flatly. Absolutely not. I'm not doing that. Julian finally put his phone down, rolling his eyes. God, Chloe, stop acting like a victim. It's 2 years. You're acting like we're asking for a kidney. You owe Dad for raising you? Raising me? I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Brenda's housekeeper raised me. I am not dropping out. And frankly, you can't force me. My tuition is covered by my academic scholarship. That's when Arthur smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the calculated smile of a predator closing a trap. Your tuition is covered, yes, Arthur said softly. But your off-campus rent, your food, your textbooks, you pay for those using the savings account your mother left you, right? My blood ran ice cold. When my mother died, she left a small life insurance payout, about $20,000, specifically designated for my college expenses. Because I was a minor when she passed, Arthur was put on the account as a joint custodian. I checked the balance yesterday, Arthur continued, his eyes dead and devoid of any parental warmth. There was $18,500 in there. I transferred it out this morning to pay for Julian's deposit on a condo in Palo Alto. The room started to spin. I felt like I had been physically punched in the stomach. You stole my money? That was Mom's money for me. I worked 2 jobs to make sure I didn't have to touch it until this year. I didn't steal anything, Arthur said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. Legally, my name is on the account. As your father, I am reallocating family resources to where they are most needed. If you want to survive, you will accept the receptionist job and move back here. If you don't, well, you'll be evicted from your apartment by the end of the month, anyway. I looked at the 3 of them. Brenda was smirking. Julian was back to scrolling on his phone. And my father, my own flesh and blood, looked at me like I was nothing more than an annoying line item on a spreadsheet that he had just successfully deleted. They thought they had me backed into a corner. They thought, without my mother's money, I would come crawling back, utterly broken, ready to serve as Julian's personal ATM. They severely underestimated how much I hated them. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. The gray rock wall I had built around my heart turned into solid steel. Keep the money, I whispered, my voice eerily calm. Consider it the price of my permanent absence. Arthur frowned, clearly not expecting this reaction. Don't be dramatic, Chloe. You have no money. You have nowhere to go. If you walk out that door right now, I am cutting you off completely. You are dead to this family. I looked him dead in the eye. I died to you the day Mom did, Arthur. Have a nice life. I turned around and walked out of that house. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't look back. I just kept walking until I reached the bus station. I had exactly $2,140 in my personal checking account from my waitressing tips. It wasn't enough to pay my tuition and keep my apartment. My father had successfully torpedoed my college career, so I did the only thing I could do. I withdrew my university enrollment, packed whatever fit into 2 suitcases, and bought a one-way train ticket to a city where my father had 0 connections. Chicago. Let me tell you, moving to Chicago in the dead of winter with $2,000 to your name is not for the faint of heart. I rented a tiny, freezing, mold-infested studio apartment directly above a loud dive bar in a sketchy neighborhood. For the first 6 months, I slept on an air mattress that deflated every 4 hours. My diet consisted entirely of 50-cent ramen noodles, peanut butter, and whatever leftover bread I could scavenge from my new job. To survive, I worked like a literal machine. By day, I waitressed at a diner. By night, I worked the graveyard shift at a massive third-party logistics, 3PL, warehouse. It was grueling, back-breaking work. I was hauling boxes, freezing on the loading docks, and dealing with screaming truck drivers at 3 a.m. But while I was freezing my hands off scanning barcodes, I was also watching, learning. I saw how grossly inefficient their routing systems were. I saw millions of dollars being wasted on deadhead miles and mismanaged inventory. I realized that my 2.5 years of college weren't wasted. I had the theoretical knowledge, and now I was getting the raw, ugly, boots-on-the-ground practical experience. While Julian was out drinking $20 martinis in Palo Alto on my mother's dime, I was sitting in my freezing apartment wrapped in a sleeping bag, teaching myself advanced supply chain optimization software on a beat-up secondhand laptop. I funneled all my anger, all my trauma, and all my hatred for my father into an obsessive drive for success. I didn't just want to survive anymore. I wanted to build an empire. I wanted to become so powerful, so undeniably successful that one day I could look down at them from the absolute top. And 3 years later, in that cramped, moldy studio apartment, Apex Solutions was born. Let me tell you, bootstrapping a tech startup when you're literally broke AF and running on fumes is not the glamorous, hustle culture aesthetic you see on TikTok. It's brutal. For 3 years, my life was nothing but coding, crying in my shower, and eating way too much discount peanut butter. But I was building something killer. My software, Apex Solutions, was designed to completely overhaul and automate supply chain logistics. I knew it was a gold mine, but I lacked the capital to scale it. I was stuck. Then, out of nowhere, I got a LinkedIn DM that completely flipped the script. It was from Clara, my late mother's younger sister. Now, I hadn't seen Aunt Clara since I was a kid. Arthur absolutely hated her guts and basically banned her from our house after my mom passed. Clara was a cutthroat corporate lawyer in New York, a total badass who didn't take shit from anyone, especially not my narcissistic dad. She tracked me down, flew to Chicago, and took me out to a fancy steakhouse. Honestly, I was just hyped for a free hot meal. But what she told me that night left me totally shook. "Your father is a snake, Chloe, but your mother wasn't stupid," Clara said, sipping her martini like it was water. She knew exactly what Arthur was capable of, and she knew he'd probably try to screw you over once she was gone. Clara pulled a thick manila folder out of her designer bag and slid it across the table. "That $20,000 life insurance policy he stole from you, that was just a decoy," Clara smirked. "A little bone she threw him to keep him distracted." Her real assets, her family inheritance, were placed in a blind trust the moment she got sick. I was the sole executor. The stipulation was that you couldn't touch it until you turned 25, or until you were financially independent and completely separated from Arthur. I stared at the paperwork, my hands literally shaking. "How much is in it?" I whispered. Clara leaned in. "After investments and compound interest over the last 15 years, just north of $1.2 million, tax-free. It's yours, kiddo. Time to build your empire." I bawled my eyes out right there in the middle of this bougie restaurant. It wasn't just about the money. It was the realization that my mom had been looking out for me from beyond the grave. She gave me the ultimate fuck you money. With that capital, Apex Solutions went from a side hustle in a moldy studio to a legit powerhouse. I moved out of the hood, hired a team of absolute rockstar developers, and started pitching to mid-level manufacturing firms. We were crushing it. Our software was saving companies millions in deadhead freight and inventory bleed. By the time I was 28, I was a self-made millionaire. But I kept my personal life completely off the grid. No flashy Instagram, no Forbes 30 under 30 interviews. I was the silent CEO. My VP of sales, a charismatic guy named David, was the public face of Apex. As far as the internet was concerned, I was just a ghost. And thank God I stayed under the radar, because 2 years later, the universe handed me the ultimate revenge on a silver platter. We were in a quarterly board meeting when David pulled up our newest and biggest prospective client on the projector. "All right, team, we just landed a massive whale, a manufacturing conglomerate in the Midwest. Their supply chain is an absolute shit show, hemorrhaging about $4 million a quarter. They are desperate for our software to stop the bleeding before they go bankrupt." He clicked the slide. The massive golden logo of Arthur's company flashed onto the screen. My heart literally stopped. "Who's running their logistics right now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice deadpan. David checked his notes. Looks like the CEO's son. Guy named Julian. Total Nepo baby. He's got a Stanford MBA, but according to their internal audits, the dude is clueless AF. He's been running their vendor network into the ground. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing like a maniac. It was poetic justice. Arthur had forced me into poverty to fund Julian's fancy MBA, and now that exact MBA was bankrupting his precious empire. "David," I said, leaning back in my chair, steepling my fingers, "close the deal. Give them the premium package, but I want ironclad NDAs from our side. They deal exclusively with you. My name does not appear on a single piece of paper, email, or invoice. We use the parent LLC for all financial transactions." David looked a little confused but shrugged. You're the boss. Secret identity it is. Within 6 months, Apex Solutions became the absolute backbone of my father's company. We completely restructured their routing, fired Julian's overpriced, shady vendors, and optimized their entire grid. We took them from the brink of bankruptcy to their most profitable year in a decade. We controlled 40% of their operational efficiency. If Apex pulled out, Arthur's company would instantly collapse like a house of cards. We had them by the balls. And the best part? Arthur and Julian were strutting around, taking all the credit for the miraculous turnaround, completely oblivious to the fact that the daughter they threw away like garbage was the puppet master keeping their lights on. I was perfectly content just collecting their massive monthly retainer and watching from the shadows. But then, the invitation arrived. The invitation to Arthur's 30th anniversary gala had arrived 2 weeks prior, printed on unnecessarily heavy gold-leafed cardstock. It was clearly a mass mailer sent to his entire address book, an automated flex to show off his wealth. I almost threw it in the trash, but Aunt Clara, sitting across from me in my penthouse office, just smirked and slid it back across my desk. Don't you think it's time they saw what a real CEO looks like? She had said. She was right. I was done hiding in the shadows. When my black car pulled up to the Ritz-Carlton downtown, the biting Chicago wind whipped around my ankles. But I didn't feel the cold. I felt electric. I wasn't the scared, broke 20-year-old girl they had thrown out into the streets 11 years ago. I stepped out of the car. I didn't wear anything flashy or desperately attention-seeking like Brenda would. I wore stealth wealth, a sleek, perfectly tailored, midnight blue Tom Ford evening gown that cost more than my first car, paired with classic black Louboutins. My hair was blown out perfectly, my makeup flawless and sharp. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who held total, unapologetic power. As I walked into the grand ballroom, the sheer scale of Arthur's ego was on full display. The room was dripping in excessive luxury, massive ice sculptures of the company logo, a towering champagne pyramid, and tables draped in imported silk. There were at least 300 people here, Chicago's elite, politicians, investors, and Arthur's board of directors. All of them drinking top-shelf liquor paid for by a company that, behind closed doors, was financially bleeding out. I grabbed a glass of vintage champagne from a passing waiter and positioned myself near a dimly lit table toward the back. I wanted to observe. It didn't take long for the vultures to spot me. Through the crowd, I saw Brenda's heavily Botoxed face snap in my direction. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second in pure shock, probably because I wasn't wearing rags, before her features instantly contorted back into that familiar fake sweet mask. She tapped Arthur's arm, whispering in his ear. Next to them stood Julian, holding a scotch, looking bloated and incredibly smug in a tuxedo that was a half size too small. Like a pack of predators zeroing in on a wounded gazelle, the three of them excused themselves from a group of investors and made a beeline for my table. Time seemed to slow down as they approached. I took a slow sip of my champagne, my face an absolute impenetrable wall of ice. Oh my God, look who crawled out of the woodwork, Brenda practically shrieked, making sure her voice was loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. She looked me up and down, her eyes narrowing as she tried to calculate the cost of my dress. Chloe, sweetie, we didn't think you'd actually show up. Did you rent that outfit? You really shouldn't put yourself in debt just to impress us. I didn't blink. I didn't get defensive. I just looked at her, letting 3 full seconds of dead silence pass before I spoke. Hello, Brenda. The filler in your cheeks is settling nicely. Very prominent. Brenda's fake smile instantly froze. Her left eye gave a microscopic twitch. She opened her mouth to snap back. But Julian stepped in, swirling his scotch with an arrogant smirk. Still got that chip on your shoulder, huh, Chloe? Julian chuckled, leaning against the table like he owned the building. Look, don't feel bad that you're just scraping by. We're doing great. Actually, Dad just promoted me to VP of Operations. I single-handedly overhauled our entire logistics network this year, saved the company from a massive slump. I guess that Stanford MBA paid off, right? I stared at Julian. The sheer, unadulterated delusion radiating from him was almost fascinating. He genuinely believed his own lies. He had no idea that his overhaul had consisted of him crying on a Zoom call to my VP of Sales, David, begging Apex Solutions to fix the catastrophic mess he had made of their supply chain. Single-handedly, I repeated, my voice soft, that laced with dangerous amusement. Wow. You must be exhausted, Julian. It takes a lot of effort to take credit for other people's work. Julian's smug grin vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine confusion. Excuse me? Before he could process the insult, Arthur stepped forward. He looked exactly the same as the day he kicked me out, cold, authoritative, and utterly self-absorbed. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't say he missed me. He just looked at me with deep disappointment. Chloe, I see you haven't learned any manners in the last decade, Arthur said, using that deep, commanding tone he used to terrify his employees. If you're here to ask for a handout, you wasted a trip. I told you 11 years ago you are cut off. We are celebrating my legacy tonight. Do not cause a scene. He didn't wait for my response. And the ballroom lights began to dim, and a spotlight hit the main stage. It was time for the keynote speech. Arthur adjusted his tie, gave me a final look of pure disgust, and walked confidently toward the podium, the crowd parting for him like the Red Sea. I stayed standing at my table in the back. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for him to step on the trigger. Arthur tapped the microphone. The soft hum of the string quartet faded out. 300 influential people fell dead silent, giving him their undivided attention. 30 years, Arthur began, flashing his million-dollar smile. 30 years ago, I started this company with nothing but a vision and relentless work ethic. Tonight, we celebrate not just a corporate milestone, but a family legacy. The crowd erupted into polite applause. Arthur soaked it in, his chest puffing out. I couldn't have built this empire without my rock, my beautiful wife Brenda. He gestured toward her, and the crowd clapped louder. And my son, Julian, who stepped up this year, took the reins of our operations and proved that the future of this company is in brilliant, capable hands. Julian raised his glass to the crowd, basking in the unearned glory. But Arthur, high on his own narcissistic supply, couldn't stop there. He needed a contrast. He needed to show the crowd how benevolent and powerful he was by putting down the one person he thought was powerless. His eyes scanned the darkened room, piercing through the spotlight, and locked directly onto me. I saw the exact moment the dark, cruel thought entered his mind. His smile morphed into a patronizing smirk. And, of course, my daughter. Chloe, Arthur said into the microphone, his voice dripping with faux pity. Heads turned. 300 pairs of eyes began searching the shadows at the back of the room. Who finally decided to show up to something important? Arthur continued, the cruelty in his voice echoing through the massive speakers. Let's hope she actually finishes her dinner tonight, since she has a habit of quitting things halfway. College, family, responsibilities. A ripple of uncomfortable, murmuring laughter washed over the ballroom. People were whispering. Brenda covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking as she laughed. Julian just shook his head, looking at me like I was pathetic. They expected me to break. They expected the 20-year-old girl who cried in his office to run out of the room in shame. Instead, I moved. Slowly, deliberately, I picked up my crystal glass of champagne. I didn't break eye contact with Arthur. I stepped out from the shadows of the back table and walked directly down the center aisle of the ballroom. Click, clack, click, clack. The sound of my heels on the marble floor cut through the lingering laughter. The confident, rhythmic pacing of my walk caused the whispers to die down instantly. The crowd parted. I walked until I was standing dead center, 10 feet away from the stage, bathed in the edge of Arthur's spotlight. I raised my glass. I'll absolutely finish my dinner, Arthur, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of that cavernous room, it carried perfectly. It was smooth, steady, and terrifyingly calm. But I think we should get the check sorted out first. Speaking of things left unfinished, how is that $18,500 you stole from your dead wife's life insurance policy holding up? Gasp. The collective sharp intake of breath from 300 wealthy socialites sounded like a vacuum. The silence that followed was so absolute, so heavy, it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Arthur's smug smile didn't just fade, it shattered. His jaw slackened. The hand holding the microphone trembled, producing a harsh, high-pitched feedback squeal that made people flinch. Chloe, what are you doing? Shut your mouth, Arthur hissed through his teeth, stepping away from the mic, his face suddenly flushed with a dark, panicked red. No, let's talk about legacy, I continued, taking another step forward, my eyes locking him down like a sniper. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. The quietness of my voice was my weapon. Let's talk about Julian, the brilliant VP of Operations. I turned slightly, locking eyes with Julian, who was suddenly gripping his scotch glass so tightly his knuckles were white. The arrogance had completely drained from his face, replaced by the panicked look of a deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. Julian, I said, projecting my voice to the crowd. Tell the board of directors here tonight about the vendor crisis in Q2. Tell them how you almost bankrupted the entire Midwest division because you didn't understand basic freight algorithms. Tell them how you cried on a conference call to a third-party software company, begging them to save you. You're insane. I don't know what you're talking about. Security! Brenda shrieked from the front table, her voice cracking in pure hysteria. She looked wildly around, her carefully crafted image crumbling into dust. I ignored her. I looked back at my father. He looked physically ill. The realization that I knew intimate, highly classified corporate secrets was hitting him like a physical blow. His eyes darted around the room, seeing his investors whispering furiously to each other, their faces grim. "How do you know that?" Arthur choked out, his voice barely a whisper, forgetting the microphone was still picking up his panicked breaths. I tilted my head, offering him a devastatingly cold smile. "Do you know a man named David, Arthur?" I asked softly. Arthur froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. Of course he knew David. David was his savior. David was the guy they paid millions to every month to keep their company afloat. "David is my VP of sales," I said, dropping the bomb with the casualness of someone commenting on the weather. "And he works for my company, Apex Solutions." I watched the exact millisecond his brain processed the information. I watched his eyes dilate in sheer, unadulterated terror. He stumbled backward, his back hitting the projection screen. The color completely drained from his face, turning him a sickly, ashen gray. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. "No," Julian breathed out from the crowd, his voice trembling. "No, that's impossible. Apex is the only reason your doors are still open," I interrupted, my voice finally taking on an edge of pure, hardened steel. "I own the proprietary software that runs your entire routing network. I control 40% of your operational efficiency. I am the puppet master who has been keeping this pathetic house of cards from collapsing for the last 12 months." The ballroom was paralyzed. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. The board of directors at the front table were staring at Arthur with pure murder in their eyes, realizing their CEO had just publicly humiliated the silent owner of their most critical vendor. I reached into my designer clutch, pulled out a thick, folded legal document, and tossed it onto the empty table nearest to the stage. It landed with a heavy thud. "That is a formal 30-day notice of contract termination," I announced, looking directly into my father's terrified, wide eyes. "As of next month, Apex Solutions is pulling our software from your servers. You will be completely blind. Your supply chain will gridlock in 48 hours. Arthur opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to try and spin it, but nothing came out. He was hyperventilating, his hands shaking violently as he stared at the legal document on the table like it was a venomous snake. Brenda was completely silent, her face frozen in an ugly mask of horror. I took one final sip of my champagne, the taste incredibly sweet. "Enjoy the rest of the gala, Arthur," I said, my voice echoing one last time. "Because this is the absolute last time you will ever see me, and it's the last time you will ever have the privilege of disrespecting me." I set the crystal glass down on the table next to the termination papers. It made a sharp, final clink. I turned around and walked back down the center aisle. 300 people watched me leave in absolute, white, stunned silence. No one tried to stop me. No one said a word. As the heavy oak doors of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom closed behind me, I could hear the immediate chaotic eruption of shouting from the board members inside. The bomb had detonated, the empire was burning. And for the first time in my life, I could finally breathe. The morning after the gala, the sun over Lake Michigan was terrifyingly bright. I was sitting behind my custom marble desk in the corner office of Apex Solutions, perched on the top floor of a downtown Chicago high-rise. I was sipping a perfectly frothed oat milk latte, watching the city wake up below me. My phone had been blowing up all night. 37 missed calls from Arthur, 14 desperate, unhinged voicemails from Brenda, a barrage of text messages from Julian ranging from, "You're a psycho bitch," to, "Please, Chloe, pick up, I'm literally begging you." I didn't answer a single one. I let them marinate in their own panic. They had just found out the hard way what the phrase, "fuck around and find out," actually meant. At exactly 9:15 a.m., the intercom on my desk buzzed. It was Marcus, my head of building security. "Ms. Chloe." Marcus's deep voice crackled through the speaker. "I have 3 individuals down here in the lobby demanding to see you. They're claiming to be your family. Honestly, ma'am, they look completely unhinged. Should I call the cops and have them trespassed? A slow, cold smile spread across my face. They actually drove. After the gala, they must have jumped straight into Arthur's Mercedes and driven 5 hours through the night from the Midwest, completely spiraling, desperate to stop the bleeding. No, Marcus, I said smoothly. Send them up to conference room B. Do not offer them coffee. Do not offer them water. Just put them in the box and let them wait. Conference room B was my favorite room in the building. It was completely encased in soundproof glass, sitting right in the middle of our bustling high-tech engineering floor. It was designed to make you feel incredibly exposed. I gave them exactly 45 minutes to sit in that glass cage, soaking in the reality of my empire, before I finally walked in. When I pushed open the heavy glass door, the smell of stale sweat, cheap airplane mints, and sheer desperation hit me like a physical wall. The contrast between how they looked last night and how they looked right now was cinematic. Arthur's expensive tuxedo jacket was crumpled on the floor. His tie was ripped off, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and his skin had this sickly grayish pallor, like a man staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. Brenda looked like a wet rat. Her heavy gala makeup had melted down her face, leaving dark raccoon-like streaks of mascara under her eyes. And Julian? The golden child was curled in on himself in an ergonomic chair, violently bouncing his leg, chewing his perfectly manicured fingernails to the quick. The second I walked in, all three of them shot up. "Chloe!" Arthur gasped, his voice raspy and completely stripped of its usual booming authority. He took a step toward me, holding his hands up like he was approaching a wild animal. "Chloe, please, let's just talk about this. As a family." I didn't step toward him. I walked slowly to the head of the long mahogany table, pulled out my chair, and sat down. I crossed my legs, rested my elbows on the table, and looked at them with the emotional detachment of a scientist observing germs in a petri dish. "Family," I repeated, letting the word hang in the freezing air of the room. "That's a very interesting vocabulary choice." Arthur, I recall you telling me 11 years ago that if I walked out of your house, I was dead to this family. So you must be speaking to a ghost." Brenda suddenly slammed her hands on the table, her fake sweet facade completely shattering. She looked utterly deranged. "You cannot do this, Chloe. Do you have any idea what you're doing? If you pull your software, the company goes under. We lose the house. We lose the cars. Julian loses his stock options. You are destroying our lives over some petty teenage grudge." "Petty?" I tilted my head, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper, the kind of quiet that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I looked dead at Julian. He physically flinched under my gaze. "Your precious son spent the last 12 months running your logistics department into the ground because he is fundamentally incompetent," I said, my words slicing through the room like a scalpel. "He signed catastrophic contracts. He bled millions in deadhead freight. I didn't destroy your company, Brenda. Your Delulu main character syndrome son did. I just decided to stop cleaning up his mess." Julian's face flushed a violent, ugly shade of crimson. "You set me up. You totally set me up. You knew it was me, and you intentionally let me fail so you could pull this psychotic stunt." "Julian, you don't need my help to fail." I laughed, a short, sharp sound completely devoid of humor. "You do that exceptionally well on your own." "Enough," Arthur roared, his fists slamming down on the table. The sudden noise made both Brenda and Julian jump, but I didn't even blink. Arthur leaned heavily against the mahogany, panting. He looked at me, and for the first time in his entire miserable life, he didn't try to intimidate me. He tried to play the victim. His eyes welled up with forced, manipulative tears. "Chloe, I know I wasn't the perfect father," Arthur choked out, his voice shaking with premium-grade gaslighting. "I know I made mistakes, but everything I did to protect the company, to protect our legacy. I pushed you hard because I knew you were strong. I knew you could survive. Julian is fragile. He needed the support. Please, Chloe, I'm an old man. Don't take everything I've built. Please." It was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. He was trying to rewrite history. He was trying to frame his abuse as some twisted form of tough love. I let a long, suffocating silence fill the room. I watched his eyes dart nervously, searching my face for any sign of empathy, any crack in my armor. He found nothing. Slowly, I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of paper and slid it across the glossy surface of the table. It stopped right in front of Arthur's trembling hands. While you were driving here, losing your absolute minds, my Aunt Clara sent me a little present, I said smoothly. She's a partner at a massive corporate law firm in New York now. She has access to a lot of interesting financial forensics. Open it, Arthur. Arthur stared at the paper like it was coated in anthrax. His hand shook so violently, he could barely unfold it. I didn't wait for him to read it. I wanted to say it out loud. I wanted Brenda and Julian to hear it. 11 years ago, you sat in your office and told me that the company was entirely out of liquid cash, I started. The memories of that day no longer bringing pain, only a cold, calculated fury. You told me that you had absolutely no choice but to drain the $18,500 life insurance policy my dead mother left for me to pay for Julian's deposit in Palo Alto. You forced me to drop out of college and tried to make me a minimum wage slave to fund his lifestyle. I leaned forward, locking my eyes onto Arthur's. The color was rapidly draining from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. But that document right there? I pointed a manicured finger at the paper. That is a bank ledger from your private offshore Cayman account. Well, it's dated the exact same week you stole my money. Do you want to tell your wife and your golden boy what the balance was, Arthur? Or should I? Brenda whipped her head toward Arthur, her eyes wide with sudden paranoia. Arthur, what is she talking about? $3.2 million. I enunciated every single syllable, dropping the hammer with absolute precision. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the micro-expressions on Arthur's face cycle through pure panic, immense guilt, and finally, total, undeniable defeat. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, but he couldn't form a single word. Julian's jaw dropped. Brenda let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp, stepping away from her husband, as if he were suddenly contagious. You didn't steal my mother's money because you were broke, Arthur, I whispered, my voice thick with absolute disgust. You stole it because you couldn't stand the fact that I was succeeding without you. You couldn't stand that I was smarter than your shiny new stepson. You didn't just want to fund Julian, you wanted to break me. You wanted me trapped, dependent, and under your thumb forever. Chloe, Arthur started, a pathetic, broken wheeze escaping his throat. Shut your mouth, I snapped. The sudden spike of volume in my voice echoed off the glass walls like a gunshot. Arthur physically recoiled, his mouth snapping shut. I stood up slowly, towering over the three of them. I had never felt so tall in my entire life. The power dynamic wasn't just inverted, it was obliterated. Here's your reality check, I said, my tone ice-cold and utterly finalized. You are not getting my software back. You are not getting a bailout. You are going to go back to your failing company. You are going to face your angry board of directors, and you are going to watch the empire you love more than your own daughter burn to the absolute ground. I looked at Brenda, who was now openly sobbing, her fake designer nails digging into her face. Then I looked at Julian, who was staring blankly at the wall, completely short-circuiting as his privileged reality collapsed around him. And if any of you, I continued, lowering my voice to a lethal, deadly whisper, if any of you ever attempt to contact me again, by phone, by email, through a lawyer, or by showing up in my lobby like pathetic stray dogs, I will hand this offshore bank ledger, along with the evidence of your corporate tax evasion, directly to the IRS and the SEC. I will make sure Arthur spends his retirement in a federal penitentiary. Arthur's knees buckled. He actually collapsed into the chair behind him, burying his face in his trembling hands. The great, terrifying Arthur reduced to a weeping, broken shell of a man in my conference room. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I pressed a button on my smartwatch. Less than 10 seconds later, the heavy glass door swung open. Marcus and two other massively built security guards stepped into the room. Marcus, I said, not taking my eyes off the miserable trio, these people were just leaving. Please escort them off the premises. If they drag their feet, feel free to call the police. Marcus nodded, his face totally impassive. Yes, ma'am. All right, folks, time to go. They didn't fight back. They didn't scream. The fight had been completely and totally beaten out of them. Arthur stood up, looking 100 years old, and shuffled toward the door without looking at me. Brenda followed, weeping loudly into her hands. Julian was the last one out, keeping his eyes glued to the floor, finally realizing he was nothing without the money that was about to disappear. I watched through the glass walls as the security team marched them across the engineering floor, into the elevator, and out of my life forever. The toxic cord was finally, permanently cut. Checkmate. It's been exactly 1 year since that morning in my glass conference room. 1 year of absolute glorious radio silence. They say karma is a mirror, but in Arthur's case, karma was a high-speed freight train with cut-off brakes. The collapse of his empire wasn't a slow burn. It was a spectacular overnight implosion. Exactly 30 days after our meeting, Apex Solutions officially pulled our software from their servers. Without our routing algorithms and vendor management systems, Arthur's logistics network suffered a catastrophic gridlock within 48 hours. Trucks were stranded, inventory was lost, and millions of dollars in perishable goods spoiled on the loading docks. But the real nail in the coffin wasn't just the supply chain failure, it was the paranoia of the board of directors. After my little microphone drop at the gala, the board ordered an immediate independent forensic audit of the company's finances. They didn't just find out about Julian's incompetence, they found the paper trail leading to Arthur's offshore Cayman accounts. They discovered years of corporate embezzlement, money he had been siphoning off to fund Brenda's insane shopping habits and Julian's luxury real estate. The board voted unanimously to oust Arthur as CEO. 3 weeks later, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Watching the fallout was like watching a masterclass in narcissistic collapse. The second the money dried up, the picture-perfect family turned on each other like starved wolves. Brenda, true to her gold-digger nature, filed for divorce the very minute Arthur's assets were frozen by the SEC. She tried to take half of everything, but since everything was tied up in federal audits and massive debts, all she walked away with was her collection of designer handbags and a heavily mortgaged condo. Last I heard, she's trying to rebrand herself as a lifestyle influencer on Instagram, but she can barely afford her Botox touch-ups. Julian's fall from grace was arguably the most pathetic. He thought his shiny Stanford MBA would guarantee him a C-suite job anywhere in the country. But the corporate world, especially in logistics, is incredibly small. Everyone knew he was the Nepo baby who single-handedly bankrupted his father's empire. He became toxic radioactive waste to any respectable HR department. The golden child is currently working as an assistant shift manager at a mid-tier regional grocery chain, driving a beat-up Honda Civic. And Arthur? He's currently under federal investigation for tax evasion and corporate fraud. He lost the McMansion, the country club memberships, and his entire identity. He is a broken, isolated old man living in a cheap rented apartment, waiting for the IRS to finish picking his bones clean. Sometimes, late at night, I check my spam folder just for a laugh. It is full of long, rambling, pathetic emails from Arthur, begging for my forgiveness, begging for a loan, begging me to tell the SEC that the offshore account was a misunderstanding. I never reply. I just hit delete and go to sleep like a baby. As for me, I am living a life my 20-year-old self couldn't have even dreamed of. Apex Solutions just acquired 2 of our biggest competitors. We went international last quarter. I finally stepped out of the shadows and accepted my role as the public CEO. Aunt Clara and I take a 2-week vacation to Europe every summer, our way of celebrating my mother's memory and the beautiful, fiercely independent life she wanted for me. But the biggest flex isn't the money. It isn't the penthouse or the designer clothes or the successful company. The biggest flex is my peace. Growing up as the scapegoat in a toxic family rewires your brain. It makes you believe that love is transactional, that your worth is tied to how much abuse you can quietly endure. Going no contact was the hardest, most terrifying thing I ever did, but it was the only way to survive. If you are listening to this right now and you are sitting in your childhood bedroom, feeling invisible, feeling like you are drowning in a sea of gaslighting and manipulation, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Blood does not make someone family. Blood is just biology. Family is about respect, safety, and unconditional support. If the people who share your DNA are the ones destroying your mental health, you do not owe them your loyalty. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to build a wall they can never climb over. Protect your peace. Build your empire in silence. And when the time is right, don't just beat them at their own game. Buy the whole damn board. So, that's my story. I went from being the invisible, discarded daughter to the silent CEO who legally dismantled my narcissistic father's entire life. But I want to hear from you guys. Did I go too far by humiliating him in front of 300 people at his own gala? Should I have just pulled the contract quietly, or did they get exactly the karma they deserved? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If you enjoyed this story of absolute petty revenge, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another crazy Reddit story. Until next time, stay toxic to the toxic people and keep building your empires. Peace out.